Chapter 18. Electricity and Ghosts, Interview with John Fox. K-Punk Post, September 23, 2006. MF, which films were most influential on you early on? JF, oh, very cheap science fiction films mostly. There was one particularly memorable movie called Robot Monster, so bad it was surreal. It had the quality of a dream, an exceptional movie. I now think it's one of the best films I've ever seen, partly because it had no regard for plot or anything else recognizable as conventional cinema of the time. This of course made it an event of inestimable importance to me, because, as a child I took it all literally, swallowed it whole, like Alice's potion. And like that potion, it allowed entry to an unexpected universe. One which had unfathomable logic and laws which were endlessly flexible. A deeply exhilarating experience. I still dream sequences from it, or rather I seem to have permanently incorporated sections of it into my dream grammar. Growing up with movies as a child and being subjected to them before I could understand the adult preoccupations and motivations involved in the plots, pitched me into conscripting these films as a personal grammar. I had no choice, so I ended up with this Lincoln reservoir of sequences that carried every dread and joy and everything in between. These events are still imbued with unfathomable, inexplicable, tantalizing mystery, because I couldn't really understand them at all. It was hallucinogenic and vivid, and provided me with an image bank and a gorgeous range of emotional tones I still haven't managed to exhaust. Much later, when I got to Cinema Dash or the official critical view of it, the more intellectual, often French aspect, I didn't recognize it at all. Later, I ended up enjoying this sort of perspective a little, but in a rather disengaged, skeptical way. To me, it seems a method of criticism which is often marvelously baroque and can be engaging, but has little to do with my own experience of cinema. I can only deal with it as a marvelous fictional construct, like medieval religion or quantum physics, a consensual social hallucination developed by a priesthood. In the end it's as tangential as my own individual one. But that very crude, improvisational, amateurish side of cinema or filmmaking, I continue to find deeply fascinating. Take for example Ed Wood's films. He made them simply because he was in a place where it could be done. I think of Ed Wood as a sort of advanced naive artist. He was among the first to make cut-up movies. He achieved this by using props he came across in warehouses and stock footage he discovered in the film vaults of Hollywood cutting rooms, then he built movies around these fragments. This is the art of collage and sampling. It is art as found object, as coincidence, as accident, as surrealism, as Dada, as situationism. All made possible and motivated also by the dynamo of American opportunism, but with great love and inadequacy and tenderness. Ed Wood was doing, 50 years ago, what the avant-garde are only now beginning to do with film. This is also very similar to the way rock and roll often manages to parallel or prefigure avant-garde concepts, by arriving at them from a totally different direction. Pop is such a virile mongrel it's capable of effortlessly demonstrating, realizing, manifesting, absorbing, remaking any sort of academic intellectual concept. It can do this so well, it often makes any parallel or previous version appear weak or even redundant. An admiration for that sort of visceral, sensual, opportunistic, native intelligence led to an interest in, and respect for, home video and Super 8 very low-grade domestic ways of making films. I suddenly realized there was a whole other world there, one which hadn't been properly discussed, but is real, in fact more real and potentially at least as powerful, as official cinema. MF, the film collection you refer to in the sleeve notes to Tiny Color Movies, you write about it very beautifully. Are there any plans for those films to be shown in the UK? JF, thanks. I'd like to. There are some problems with these fragments, because they're so small. They're physically difficult things, and they're unique, irreplaceable and very fragile, so you can only ever show digital copies of them. But it would be interesting to do something like that. I'm beginning to look at some possibilities now, working with Mike Barker, who has accumulated a marvelous archive, and we're discussing this with some film festivals. MF, I noticed you thanked Paul Auster in the sleeve notes. Why was that? JF, Paul Auster is very interesting to me, because I wrote this thing called The Quiet Man years ago, in the 80s, in fact I'm still writing it. Then I read the New York trilogy, and it struck so many chimes. It was as if I'd written it, or it was the book I should have written. I have to be very careful to find my way around it now. Such occurrences are simultaneously rewarding and terrifying. They illustrate the fact that there is something in the air, which is tremendously heartening after working alone for years, yet they scare you because it feels as if someone has published first, and therefore registered their claim to where you discovered gold. I simply wanted to acknowledge the effect, and the odd sort of encouragement of recognized themes, as well as a continuing parallel interest in the idea of lost movies and fragments. There's a certain kind of London effect that's interesting, of stillness, and the city being overgrown, which is sort of recurrent in your work. Where's that come from, do you think? JF, when I first came to London it seemed a great deal like Lancashire, where I'd come from. But Lancashire had fallen into ruin. The factories had closed, the economy had faltered. We felt like the Incas after the Spaniards had passed. Helpless, nostalgic savages adrift in tea ruins. I grew up playing in empty factories, huge places which were overgrown. I remember trees growing out of the buildings. I remember certain moments of looking at it all and thinking what it would have been like when it was all working. What life might be like, if it were all working still. All of my family worked in mills and factories and mines. And all this was gently subsiding, spinning away. Coming to London, I couldn't help but wonder if it might also fall into dissolution. Then I saw a picture a friend had. It was a realistic painting of what appeared to be a view over a jungle from a high place. Gradually you came to realize that it was a view of an overgrown city from a tower, then you realized that this panorama was from a ruined center point and you could see Tottenham Court Road, Oxford Street, Charing Cross Road and the undergrowth. It felt like a revelation. It manifested so perfectly this vision I'd had of everything becoming overgrown, an overgrown London. A vision of longing and nostalgia tinged with fear. I would often experience a feeling of stillness and wonder as I walked through certain parts of London. I often walked through empty buildings and neglected, overlooked places and they would replay that sensation very strongly. I went to Shoreditch, in 1982, and made a studio there. When we first went into the studio building it had trees growing out of the windows on the upper stories. It was very like Lancashire, that whole area was derelict, had been abandoned, because that had been the industrial bit of the East End. Now there was no one there, it was empty. It gave me that calm drifting feeling of recognition. There was some kind of collective image of overgrown and abandoned cities at that time. Perhaps it's always there. Such images were present in Ballard, Burroughs, Philip K. Dick. In those science fiction authors writing about the near future, conducting thought experiments, exploring likely consequences and views of the unrecognized present, which I think is very valuable. They offer perspectives and meditations on our vanity and endeavors. As such they maintain continuity with a long line of imagery, from religious myths and folk stories to science fiction. It seems to have a real unconscious resonance, this idea of overgrown cities. It's obviously there in surrealist paintings, which seem to be a constant reference, especially in your early work. JF, yes, there's that side of it too. In science fiction films you often get those recurrent images, which I think are very beautiful, of someone walking through an abandoned city. We have accumulated a range of such images all along the line, from folk and fairy tales, to the actual construction of follies and romantic overgrown gardens, to the truly dislocated, such as Piranesi's ruins and prisons, to Max Ernst's paintings, or Bruegel's Tower of Babel, or the background urban locations in Bosch, as well as Dicker Eco's townscapes and shadows. Planet of the Apes has one of the most shocking and resonant, the end of original movie, where we see the Statue of Liberty tilted in the sand. A real jolt, the first time you see it. A modern take on Shelley's Ozymandias. The radiance I sometimes refer to occupies this sort of area. I often see people as if in a frozen moment and they seem to have an internal glow inside them. Their skin seems translucent and they carry their own time. I feel calm and distant and warm from this. It can happen in an instant. In very mundane urban situations. You realize you are not looking at a single person, but at a sort of stream or cascade. It happened yesterday in a supermarket. I happened to glance at a young woman who looked like a transfigured hidden Madonna. She wore jeans and a t-shirt, an ordinary woman. But equally, she was a continuity, a lovely genetic physical thread to other times, both previous and ahead and still unformed. She simply glowed. Quietly and unknowingly luminous. The eternal woman. The sort of feelings you deal with are more abstract. It's like you go to those states without reference to the way they've traditionally been coded, really. You often use the word angelic, or angel. JF, yes, very perilous territory, especially since these terms have since been co-opted by New Agers. I'll put on the gray suit to dispel all that. Many of these spring from what I think of as thought experiments - things I employ all the time, as a tool to get at half-buried or emerging realizations. If you're at all interested, I'll try to outline a few. Firstly, the idea interested me, still does, of parallel evolutions - imagine something that may have evolved alongside us, something we're not quite aware of yet, that we haven't yet discovered. That may include things which exist in other planes or by other means, or things which resemble human beings so well that we assume them to be human, but they may not be. Yet they live among us undetected, the possibility that other forms of life may have evolved alongside us, but invisible because of their proximity. Hiding in plain sight is a great idea, something that's very interesting in itself, on one level connected with sleight of hand and parlor tricks and conmen, but on the other hand, very subtle, intuition-led perceptions. It could give rise to situations that are tremendously moving, fragile, tender. Metaphorically very resonant. Another one, I'm also very interested in the concept of a singularity. An event that only happens once, or once every 1,000 or million years. There may be rhythms which extend over tens of millions of years and are therefore unrecognizable to us, except as single unconnectable and unexplainable events. But the fact that we have no context to fit them into doesn't mean they don't happen. Yet another thought experiment posits the concept of angels as a connection between things, an entity that only exists between. A sort of web or connection. They arise purely as an intrinsic, invisible and unsuspected component of the evolution of the ecology that supports whatever they exist between. They cannot exist on their own. Many of us have these little incidents, everything from coincidences onward - things that we can't explain using the references we commonly employ. I'm very interested in those things, always have been. Through those odd things, we glimpse something that's outside the way we usually look at the world, and realize there might be another way of looking at it, an alternate perception to the one we have, and I think that's a very valuable possibility to keep hold of. The awareness that maybe there are gaps in our perception that we aren't able to fill yet. Yes, because I think one of the most powerful things, which comes out in tiny color movies but in retrospect has always been there, is that you're able to deal with positive, affirmatory feelings that are eerie and uncanny, and possess a certain kind of calm serenity. JF, good, somehow that's always been a vital component of that sort of experience, for me. A sensation of utter calm and stillness. Miles away from any agitation. It seems deeply positive. It's an opposite to the excitement you get from, say, rock and roll. I think in general we like to stir ourselves up in various ways, using art or using media or whatever, and I think it's just as valid to move against the norm, and the norm at the moment is to speed everything up. I mean, that's what we're trying to attain, aren't we, through media? That awful maximization of time and efficient transmission of information. Some of this is economic, time equals money, and some is simply done because it can be done, and has become an unquestioned convention. If you could time jump to show the average TV ad of today to someone 20 or 30 years ago, they wouldn't understand it. The ad would depend on the viewer's perception speed and also on a series of recent references. Our parents simply weren't fast enough, they hadn't been accelerated as we have been by media and the pace of modern life, and they also don't have the inculcated, busy reference chain. Acceleration is also kind of exciting and interesting, I mean I really enjoy it, sometimes. But it equally leads you to think what happens if you do the opposite ? It might be just as pleasurable and just as valid to do that. So, one of the things I want to try to do is work on the other end of the spectrum, see what happens when you slow things down. I was surprised when I was doing the first music for Cathedral Oceans, using echoes that were 30 seconds long, so the rhythms were 30 seconds between the beats. It was very interesting slowing down enough to work with that intuitively. You had to do it. You had to synchronize with the track in order to be able to work with it. And it's very interesting kind of state you get into, intense, yet calm and tranquil. A sort of trance state. I think it's particularly on the LPs with Harold Budd, where you get that sort of aching plateau, where you slow down so much that any perturbation has a massive effect really. Harold was one of the first people who got that right, I think. One of the very first to have sufficient courage to leave enough space in the music and not fill spaces unnecessarily. Not decorate. Takes an awful lot of quiet courage to do that. When this is done, it allows an alternative ecology to emerge, one based on events that are much less frequent. And that, of course, affects their significance. You are drawn to them in a sort of smiling fascination, rather than the usual pop music method of lapel-grabbing bombardment. MF, it seems to be something similar to what you get in Tarkovsky films where either people say oh, this is too slow I can't stand it, or they enter into the slow time of the film and anything that happens almost becomes too much. JF, exactly, you can concentrate on any event very thoroughly, when that mode of perception is made available. Events become stately and welcome and valued and significant, and their arrival and departure can be fully experienced. The lack of jostling allows that sort of elegant notional space to open up. It functions at the other end of the spectrum from commercial TV and cinema, and of rock and roll. Both ends can be equally interesting, I think. MF, it seems to me that you've always imposed the stillness and calmness of painting and photography or a certain type of film onto the agitation of rock, really. Certain kind of dreams, the dreams we're most familiar with, are hyper-agitated, full of urgency etc., but there's another type of dream quality you seem to get to where those urgencies are suspended and you're out of that everyday life push and pull, really. I wondered, there seems to be a certain aching, or longing quality, these are words you seem to use a lot in your music. JF, well, dreams are a very important component. I realize that it is not simply the image you present yourself with, in a dream, which is important. It's also the emotional tone of the scene. You can see a cloud, but this will be accompanied by a sense of wonder or by a sense of dread, and it is that accompaniment which determines its meaning. The employment of these images and tones are some of the things that everyone shares, aren't they? They're composed of bits of unique personal events and references and memories, such as longings that you might have had when you were a child. When your parents are away even for an hour it feels as though it goes on forever and you really deeply miss them, and the abstraction, the tone component of that just carries on through life. Gets applied to different situations. These longings, and all other emotional parts of the spectrum join the repertoire of tones we see and apply. Some moments last forever. MF, but there's almost a positive side, almost an enjoyment of longing and ache. JF, oh yes, where the observer part of you acknowledges an emotional connection with the rest. Simultaneously you feel as though you are very integrated, yet you are being gently pulled away from yourself. Gently disengaged. MF, isn't the emotionless quality of your music more to do with a certain kind of calm? JF, yes, it's quite a complex thing, a compound. There are states where there's a sensation of time passing, things changing, knowing the world is changing, falling in on itself, and reforming. And you may even be in the process of doing just that yourself. But there are moments where you just stand by and watch it all, where you're aware of it, in a moment that seems to go on forever. So it's something of standing in a still place and watching the patterns in passing crowds and even in your own life. It can be a very powerful experience. That stillness, and the maintenance of a quiet dignity in the face of insurmountable circumstances can be immensely moving to witness. It can be much more effective and moving if someone tells the story in an unemotional or undramatic way. You find that Inishiguro. Remains of the Day or Never Let Me Go are good examples of that kind of writing, where the most important components remain unstated. The leopard is suffused with, and is dependent on a variant of this. It's also allied to a device used in different ways by Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Cary Grant. An archetypical figure attempts to retain dignity in the face of the worldly chaos while remaining ever hopeful of romance. And with Ballard and Burroughs, you get an almost gentlemanly, middle-class version of a similar sort of stance, mayhem of all kinds observed from a disengaged viewpoint.